Hello everyone. Over this first week of the course, we'll be focusing on strategic planning. And the idea is that we gain a deeper understanding of how organizations develop plans and execute strategy in the pursuit of organizational goals. We start here with this recording, which offers some basic definitions and foundational concepts that sort of ease us into this content area. I'm sure many of you will have professional experience with strategic planning, so you may consider a lot of this information as a refresher. Nevertheless, I think it's always important to remind ourselves why we engage in strategic planning. So here goes. The first part of this recording is dedicated to understanding some key strategic planning terms. Banding around the word strategy or saying something is strategic is pretty commonplace, but my feeling is that much of the time this might be being used slightly out of context. So let's take a look. We start with the general term strategy, which is a collection of decision-making rules for guidance of organizational behavior. Strategy arises from the need for direction and focus in the manager's search for and establishment of new opportunities to provide the services for which the organization was instigated. The illustration on this slide represents that need for direction and focus. Specifically, strategic direction refers to the actions you are taking to achieve the goals of your organizational strategy. Building on the definitions from the previous slide, it's important to understand how strategy fits within the broader turning cogs of the organization. And what you will see from the graphic on this slide is that strategy is very much integral. Here, strategy is the bridge between an organization's vision and its tactics. And again, you see how strategy, which is the why, defines the rules of engagement, which in turn determine the tactics, which are the what and the who. There are actually plenty of opportunities through sport to further understand this difference between strategy and tactics. I will reveal my novice level knowledge of American football here. And side note, like leisure and leisure, football is another one of the words I struggle to compromise on. To me, football is football, or what in America is called soccer, which makes American football just that, American football. Anyway, in American football, like all sports, the goal is to win, and there are lots of ways to approach that goal. For example, as head coach, I might decide that our best chances of winning is by sticking to a strict passing game. Okay, passing is the strategy, which makes actions like lining up in a shotgun formation with 4 wide receivers a specific tactic within that overarching strategy. On the slide here, you see the goal of reaching X. The strategy here is take the river, and the tactic is use a boat. While there are alternative tactics under this strategy, like you could swim down the river, the tactic of using a boat seems pretty obvious. There also doesn't seem to be too much of a difference between the idea of taking the river and using a boat, but that's purposeful because tactics must be aligned with strategy. Otherwise, you could argue that the strategy is either poorly communicated or is actually not the optimal approach. Strategy, of course, exists at different levels. Okay, so you've got agency strategy, which are the rules for developing external relationships in the organization's environment. You've got an administrative strategy, which are the rules for developing internal relationships and procedures within the organization. And then there's operating policies, which are the rules by which the organization operates on a day-to-day basis. I've inverted the pyramid here to reflect the scope of each level of strategy. So in other words, as you move from the agency or corporate strategy down to administrative or business level strategy, and then further down to operating or functional policies, the scope of what is included within such strategy narrows. Remember, we use the word strategy, we are referring to the how through the established decision-making rules. At some point in your career, you've probably heard or read about Porter's generic strategies for creating competitive advantage, which relates specifically to agency strategy or corporate strategy. Porter suggests that these strategies are relevant across all industries and sectors, and suggests that all organizational strategy can be identified through one of these four typologies. So in cost leadership, a firm sets out to become the low-cost producer in its industry. For example, a public recreation facility with subsidized rates and economies of scale may derive an advantage over its private sector counterparts through cost or cost leadership. In a differentiation strategy, a firm seeks to be unique in its industry within specific dimensions or criteria that are widely valued by customers and consumers within that particular industry. It selects one or more attributes that many buyers in an industry perceive as important and uniquely positions itself to meet those needs. Personally, I always feel like public recreation and parks agencies are uniquely positioned to offer sort of novice and beginner level experiences in a sort of non-judgmental and welcoming environment, which isn't necessarily always something you can say about private competitors. So that might be a key criteria in which a public recreation agency looks to differentiate and specialize. The generic strategy of focus rests on the choice of a narrow competitive scope within an industry. The focuser selects a segment or group of segments in the industry and tailors its strategy to serving them to the exclusion of others. In cost focus, a firm seeks a cost advantage in its target segment, while in differentiation focus, a firm seeks differentiation in its target segment. Ian Hodgkinson from Loughborough University in the UK published some research in 2013 where he sought to explore whether the generic strategies typical of the private sector are in fact appropriate in the public leisure sector. The research was based on the assumption that public leisure providers like parks and recreation agencies have a dual strategic agenda that refers to both business and social performance objectives. The findings suggest that strategy matters not only in the private sector but also in the public sector. The research suggests that there's no need for a fundamental redefinition of strategy content for public services, rather just a need to acknowledge and reflect the specific context and characteristics of such services. Cost leadership strategies were not considered optimal solutions for the long-term health of public leisure providers and actually has a detrimental impact on the quality and maintenance levels of public facilities over time. Ultimately, Hodgkinson concludes that it's a hybrid strategy which is the most relevant, okay, which seeks to add value while also having a cost base that permits low prices relative to competitors. And this appears to be the best fit or fit for purpose in terms of the public leisure sector. If you're interested in reading further, I have actually included the research article on Canvas as a supporting material. We need to be strategic about this. Okay, I've heard this phrase all too often throughout my career, but I often say, what do you mean? What are you meaning by that? Okay, and generally speaking, being strategic relates to the identification of long-term or overall aims and interests and the means of achieving them. Writing for Smart Company, my namesake Sue Barrett suggests that when an organization is being strategic, it means the organization takes an outside-in view of how things are and should be done. So in other words, they base their methods and operations on what customers want, not what they do. The organization is also proactive, so strategic companies make things happen at a time that suits them rather than waiting for events to force them to change. Being strategic means that everything is aligned, okay? The entire organization is committed to the journey, not just a department or two. And being strategic is also where everyone is involved and is committed to an inspiring vision and purpose. I've highlighted some of the key words here. So in essence, being strategic is being outside in, proactive, aligned, and committed to a vision and purpose. Now we move from the social construct of being strategic to strategic planning as a more tangible approach and process. Shivers and Halpers suggest strategic planning is a rational approach to defining the organization's future direction for a period of 3 to 5 years. It requires the identification of organizational objectives and evaluation of the agency's ability to satisfy them, and it is a group process involving the stakeholders and those who will be tasked to enact the actual strategy. There are many versions of the strategic planning process, which include varying numbers of steps and complexity. Here on this slide is the process we will use as a framework to discuss strategic planning in this course. In this process, the process starts with the mission from which goals and objectives are then derived. Then the organization undergoes a sequence of strategy formulation and implementation, which is underpinned by a process of strategy evaluation and control. The output of the strategic planning process is the strategic plan, which articulates how an organization achieves its objectives. Therefore, the strategic plan has become the instrument for or just directing the organizational intent. Importantly, strategy will not make a consistent contribution to the achievement of organizational objectives unless it is formulated into and articulated through a plan. Employees need something tangible to latch onto rather than just a series of abstract concepts and ideologies that maybe senior level management hold. In the same breath, the need for a strategic plan needs to be balanced with the risk that developing a strategic plan becomes merely a box checking exercise. A further important definition here is that of the master plan. All right, the example on this slide is taken directly from the Parks and Recreation Strategic Master Plan for the town of Brownsburg in Indiana. As the passage states, a strategic plan is a directional document that looks at the long-term future of the town's parks and recreation system in the context of its changing environment, the needs and desires of its citizens, and its internal operation. On the other hand, the master plan includes public input into how town residents use parks and recreation facilities, what they feel the priority of capital improvement should be for the system for the next 5 to 10 years. As such, the Parks and Recreation Strategic Master Plan is born for the town of Brownsburg. Now, I think it's important to recognize that there are variations from this particular understanding of that relationship between strategic plan and master plan. You are also likely to see organizations with a separate master plan and strategic plan, and the relationship is that the master plan is often a longer term strategic framework within which a shorter term strategic plan sits and exists. There is of course no one size fits all best practice here. What is important to establish is buy-in into the strategic direction and to formulate a plan of attack that leads to the most effective implementation. We now move into the second part of this recording, and the next series of slides relate to strategic planning considerations. That is, what are some of the foundational questions organizations or people within organizations need to or should consider when thinking about strategic planning? I'd like to start here with this sort of anecdotal phrase, which is somewhat ubiquitous: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And at the surface level, I can see how an organization would not want to tactically impede itself by changing a particularly successful business formula. But how does this phrase link to strategic planning? Another way to look at strategic planning is to think about how it allows organizations to choose courses of action in an integrated fashion and continually ensuring that the course of action selected continues to be the most appropriate one. So in other words, doing what you are doing or what you've been doing may really be the best option, but you can only be sure of that as a result of continuous investigation. So even in a period of success, an organization needs to continually check that its approach is offering optimal results, which necessitates this future outlook, forward-thinking, strategic approach. I've included a couple of quotes here from successful individuals in their own right. So first is Bill Gates, who said, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It doesn't apply anymore. If it ain't broke, it's obsolete." And then Colin Powell said, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it," is the slogan of the complacent, the arrogant, or the scared. It's an excuse for inaction, a call to non-arms. Building on the notion that organizations should dismiss the "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" mentality is the case for strategic planning. Okay, so master plans lay out an organizational framework for improving parks and recreation facilities, programs and services to better serve the public. Also, master plans shape the delivery of local government parks and recreation services, programs and activities in a manner that is consistent with a local government's comprehensive plan and policy agenda. So beyond the idea that failing to plan reduces the likelihood that organizations will fail to retain their competitive advantage over the long term, Shivers and Halper also suggest that citizens want to know just what they are supporting in public recreational services. Therefore, strategic planning serves an important function within public recreational services as a means of public accountability. So when should you engage in strategic planning? Luckily for recreation and parks agencies, there's sort of a blueprint of 3 to 5 years for each strategic plan, but in the private sector, these time horizons are less established. One way to approach strategy formulation is to consider where the organization, brand or product is within the life cycle model. We know that strategic planning will be a necessity for startup organizations looking to enter the introduction stage, but similarly organizations recognizing their transition into the next stage, whether that be growth or maturity, may also feel the need to revisit its strategic planning and strategic plan. The table on this slide is taken from the book titled Products and Services Management and shows, in particular with a marketing focus, the shifting objectives, strategies and tactics of companies across the different stages. Likewise, the timing of strategy formulation may also be determined by disruption. Shivers and Halper suggest explicit strategy formation is necessary when there is rapid disruption in the environment in which the organization functions. Examples include changes in the political climate, technological innovations, changes in demography, population movement, and economic recession or retrenchment. And some of these we will discuss later on through this course as we progress into future modules and topics. Under changing circumstances, traditional organizational patterns and experiences are no longer capable of coping with either new opportunities or dangers, which necessitates this need for new strategy formulation. As we've seen, the purpose of new strategy formulation is to drive change, because if it wasn't, then organizations would retain the same strategic plan for much longer, maybe indefinitely. If we go back to the product lifecycle model, the stage of maturity signifies a time where the product realizes an optimal level of growth and popularity before cresting and entering a stage of decline. And in these circumstances, or even in situations of significant disruption, an organization may need to undertake more substantial change or even reinvention. I've included on Canvas an article by Bertolini, Duncan and Waldeck that introduces the concept of fault lines. These fault lines are 5 interrelated situations that can indicate the ground beneath a company is unstable. So in essence, executives who are able to detect these fault lines have early warning of industry upheaval and can prepare and adapt. These fault lines relate to customer needs, performance metrics, industry position, business model, and talent and capabilities. The article also describes how to diagnose these fault lines. Thanks for listening to this recording. This is the first of 3 recordings in this module. Next up are some thoughts on mission, goals, and objectives. Bye for now.